Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. Once again, I want to thank all of you who've been joining us throughout the years. Can you believe it's almost been 20 years since we started broadcasting this show, Living in Mexico, through Grupo Imagen in English, trying to explain what's going on in Mexico in English. There's been very few attempts to try to do this, and we're still on the air, and it is in part because all of you have been joining us throughout the years. So I really, really appreciate it. On the show, we usually deal with Mexican politics. We deal a lot with Mexican corruption. Of course, we deal almost weekly with issues that have to do with violence, violence and crime in Mexico, U.S. foreign policy. And of course, we've been talking about the Mexican economy and finance almost every other week. Well, this week we're going to focus once again on elections in the United States. There's many reasons to do that, in part because there's a lot of our listeners are Americans interested in trying to understand what's going on in the United States. It's difficult to describe what's going on in the United States right now, but more importantly, what the results of the U.S. elections has an enormous impact with what happens in Mexico. And I've been following the U.S. elections in this show since I don't know, since 2004, and it's always 2004, and it's always interesting to try to anticipate how the elections take place, who are the candidates, how do they view Mexico, is Mexico better off having a Democrat as a president or a Republican as a president? So there's all these kind of legends, debates, traditions, but more importantly, it's important, especially right now, to understand what's going on in the United States. In fact, to the point where I don't know about you, Gritcha, I feel that in order to understand what's going to happen in the next 6 years here in Mexico, I think it much more depends what happens in the United States. By the way, Raether is joining us today. Many of you who've been following us the year must remember him. He joined us numerous times 4 years ago when there was elections in the United States, and trying to help us describe or try to understand what Democrats abroad was doing in Mexico. You were at the time a representative of Democrats abroad, but now you're a political analyst, and I know you have been following very closely what's happening in the United States. So let's just start out with, how should Mexicans interpret what happened in the United States with this change of candidate? I mean, there's been a lot of question marks. I mean, even the president of Mexico has commented on that, kind of questioning U.S. democracy. But how do you describe this change? Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ana Maria. It's a pleasure to be here with you again in another cycle of elections, and we get to talk about this, you and me, probably on a daily basis. So I think Mexicans, like Americans, for the most part, speaking of Democrats, were elated that Biden was out. I think it was very clear that age had caught up with him, that he probably wasn't best suited to be in charge of the government for the next 4 years. And of course, there was a lot of concern because, as you know, Mexicans are right now in a state of being seized by violence and by drug cartels, and a lot of insecurity in Mexico. And there's always this lingering hope that somehow America, the U.S., is going to come and save us from our own mess. And I think that having Biden at the front was kind of removing any possibility of that happening, given that they didn't do much in the last 4 years in terms of that, and probably with his mental state was less likely to happen. So I think most people were elated in Mexico that now there's somebody at the front that is young, that understands what's going on, that understands the importance of the relationship with Mexico, and somebody who can actually have a fighting chance of winning against Trump. I'm not saying that she's in a great position. I think it's a little late in the game, but definitely there's a feeling of re-energized hopefulness that whatever happens in the elections will be much better than what would have happened if Biden had continued as a candidate.
There is kind of this sense of optimism, perhaps too much, because as you remember in 2016, I still am in shock the fact that Donald Trump won. and I'm sure he's still in shock that he won. But there is, like you said, there's a sense that there's at least a fighting chance that she can win. Now, when I start listening to my colleagues, and I'm sure you listen to our Mexican colleagues that analyze the events in the United States, it's very interesting to listen to their optics of what is going on and how do they describe, the fact that, she's a woman, Donald Trump is a bully. I think there's a lot of expectations to see how the campaign's going to take place. There's a lot of expectations for the debate, which, by the way, I don't know if you've been following Donald Trump's recent comments. There's even doubts that he is going to go to the next and probably last debate, presidential debate. But beyond that, I think what is fascinating is what is the moment this election in the United States taking place, because Kamala Harris is potentially going to be the first president of the United States, and Mexico, in fact, will have their first woman president. So it's an extraordinary moment, not only in regards to women's rights, but in general, when you think about, how long it's taken in the United States, if it happens, and in Mexico to have the first woman president.
Absolutely, and it's wonderful because really, Kamala encompasses everything that at least Democrats have been looking to achieve. That is a woman president, and two minorities in one. Although Trump doesn't quite grasp this concept, but she is half black, half Indian, and she, in that sense, she encompasses what the Democratic Party stands for. Now, this is so late in the game, and I don't know if this was Democratic strategy to wait this long to have Biden step down, because they knew that the Republicans didn't have a strategy. They built everything around who and what Biden was, and now they're clueless as to how to even start to attack Kamala. The only thing they could come up with, being Republicans, is that she's a female and that she is in a minority. And they can't say that, because then that truly makes it apparent and clear that they're homophobic, that they're racist, and that they're xenophobic, and that they're misogynistic. And so they can't go that route, but they have nothing else on her. So at this point, I don't know if this was strategy on the Democrat side or just sheer luck that things are turning out the way they are. If you look at swing states, she's actually been able to now have, according to some polls, an advantage in the swing states. And you and I know that what determines the election are the swing states. It doesn't matter, and this is why some of her candidates for VP choices don't make sense, because they don't necessarily bring a state that is going to call this election. So ultimately, apologies. So ultimately, what she needs to do is definitely pick a VP. She has 5 days to do that. She has to do it before August 7th. And that's, I think, what's going to basically be the last nail on the coffin for Trump, if we are to be optimistic and really give her this fighting chance. But again, look at swing states, and she already has some advantage. And I think that Trump and his entire organization are running around like headless chickens because they don't understand how this could have happened.
Well, and they just didn't have plan B. And I could almost bet that if Donald Trump knew that Joe Biden wasn't going to run and it would be Kamala Harris, the candidate, he may have not chosen J.D. Vance. And I think as days go by, it becomes quite, if you watch their body language on TV, it is quite clear that Trump is not very comfortable with him for different reasons. It may be his attitude. It may be, he's a very smart man, and he's highly educated. But, maybe it's like the alpha male competition among them. So I don't know, but I don't think they're very comfortable. But more importantly, I asked our audience to just close their eyes for a second. Close your eyes. And can you imagine if something happened to Donald Trump, J.D. Vance becoming president of the United States? I mean, that's what is at stake here. And they did that to Kamala. They're like, close your eyes. Can you imagine Kamala Harris becoming president of the United States? And yeah, she was young and less experienced than she has right now. But now you can see it. I think she's grown into the job. I have to go to commercial Grisha, I have to go to commercial break, but please stick around and we're going to continue this conversation immediately after commercial break. So
Sure.
please don't go away. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. I'll be right back. Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you so much for joining us. My Twitter account for this show is or X account now, at Mexico Daily. And I also tweet a lot in Spanish. I send out a lot of messages, both in Spanish and in English, on my personal account, which is at AM Salazar, which is, by the way, the best way to find me, especially I'm writing a lot about elections in the United States, and I'm writing a lot about what's happening in Mexico. So just check out these accounts at Mexico Daily or at AM Salazar. Joining us today is Gritcha Raether. He is a political analyst. He represented Democrats abroad 4 years ago, right?
That's
And you've been talking about elections, U.S. elections for quite a while now. What do you suggest to our audience to follow regarding the next upcoming weeks in order to try to understand what could be different in terms of policies that a potential Kamala Harris president could be embracing, particularly in some of these issues, which is migration, issues which affect Mexico a lot, and of course trade issues. I don't know, what issues are you following and trying to understand what kind of president she's going to be?
So fundamentally, there's two perspectives. There's the perspective from the U.S. and what is she going to do differently or continue to do what Biden has been doing, and how is she going to position herself against Trump in terms of the commerce and the economy, security, immigration, and fentanyl. Of those aspects, obviously, one of those important ones that's coming up that's going to affect both countries, both sides of the border, is the TEMEC, right? Is the USMCA, which
Yeah.
basically needs to be renegotiated in 2026. And you know that if Trump goes back to power, he will use that in a way of forcing the hand of Mexico, like he did last time around, threatening to raise tariffs in order to force the Mexican government to send their troops to the southern border and somehow stop that large flow of immigration. Now, Trump would probably do that. And what they're doing is they're now pushing for the Democrats to also have to take a stance in terms of fentanyl that is killing, well, it's killing between 100 and 120,000 Americans a year. Trump said 300,000, but you can only believe half of what he says. And the other is indeed the immigration situation. And you know that Kamala has somewhat of a weak stance on that because she was assigned the job of fixing the problem at the border. And
Well, she was assigned to address the issues that promote immigration towards the United States. I mean, at the end of the day, the perception is that her responsibility was to try to figure out what to do, at least politically, with illegal entries on the southern border of the United States. And
absolutely,
she
but
just didn't do very well.
that's the thing. And whether she did something or not, because she did have the trips to Central America, and they
Right.
are providing funds so that things get better down there. But the reality is she didn't even show up at the border for the photo op. I mean, the optics of not going to the border put her in a pretty bad light in terms of that. And that was also one of the most visible things that she was tasked with, and she failed. So how this transfers over to now her being in charge and fixing, again, the same problem that still persists at the border. It's still a mess. And we have the situation with the fentanyl. how is she going to address that with Mexico, understanding that unlike Trump and the Republicans, she will probably not threaten us with the USMCA and with increasing tariffs. So I would say commerce, fentanyl, drug issues, drug cartels in Mexico, and illegal immigration are once again going to be the three main topics that we need to look into.
Well, and she will not threaten with probably sending drones or missiles against drug cartels, which Donald Trump has.
Yes.
And Donald Trump has just openly said he's gonna close the border, I guess the first day he is back in the White House. I mean, he is, his view of the world in terms of how do you solve problems, it's, of course, is very different than prior presidents, and especially different than Joe Biden. I mean, Donald Trump believes that he used the power of the United States to basically bully allies into doing what he wants. And, sometimes it works, but, in the long run, it won't. And of course, watching Mexican history or reading about Mexican history for the last 100 years, it just doesn't go well when the United States bullies or invades Mexico. It makes it harder to solve problems that require cooperation from both sides of the border. And I'm not too sure Andrés Manuel Lopez Obrador understands that. I mean, he always seems to be talking quite favorably about Donald Trump or defending, but above all, not favorably, just defend Donald Trump. And with Biden, it's been interesting. I don't know if you've noticed. He just says, well, his advisors have not told Joe Biden. He's misinformed about certain positions that the U.S. has taken against Mexico. So I don't know what's going to happen in terms of cooperation with anti-narcotics cooperation or trying to stall the flow, but I think she will still try to have an attitude in terms of, let's see if we can figure out a way to do this so that the United States doesn't have to close the border. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think that threatening to close the border, and this is just another example where Trump clearly doesn't understand the lay of the land. Closing the border, and this has been done a couple of times along Texas, where all the communities on the border realized a large part of their economy depended on the Mexican side, people coming in and buying products, people shipping. You close that border, you hit Americans probably in their pocket a lot harder than you do Mexicans. So if he thinks he's punishing Mexico by closing the border, the reality is that he's punishing his own citizens. So I think this is just a lot of big talk from Trump. He's just trying to show he's a strong man, America first and all this stuff. But the reality is once if he were to come back to the White House and he's in that Oval Office, that the reality is going to hit him pretty hard. And whomever ends up being the president, whether it's Kamala or Trump, both are going to have to deal with this very serious situation that affects everybody, Republicans and Democrats alike, which is the issue with the drugs and the fentanyl. And so how Kamala ends up working together with the next president in Mexico, because it didn't work with very closely with AMLO. As you know, there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of friction in terms of dealing with the cartels. And we know there's collusion in Mexico between the government and the cartels. And so how they deal with that and how they diplomatically force the hand of Mexico without threatening to invade and destroy and send missiles and so on and drones to Mexico is going to be very interesting. The tactics and the strategy is going to be very different, but I think in the end, they have to accomplish the same thing, and that is fix this problem that is, again, killing so many Americans.
Or mitigate the impact. I mean, it just seems that's why when you listen to Trump and if he does come back to the White House, I mean, I think he will now do things that you and I think it's outrageous, unconstitutional, unethical, immoral, but I think it's quite clear, since he's not looking, hopefully he's not going to try to seek re-election, another, unconstitutional position to stay in the White House. But if he comes back to the White House, what worries me? He has nothing that is going to stop him now, simply because he doesn't have to worry about seeking re-election, and he could do crazy, fruity loopy decisions that could have an enormous impact on Mexico. on Mexico and U.S. Exports and the bilateral relationship. And I just don't know if he is going to be willing to sit down and listen to his advisors. He didn't do it the first 4 years. He didn't listen to the State Department. He didn't listen to the smart people in the White House that he surrounded himself initially. So I don't get any sense that he's going to do much better. I assume he's going to do much worse in terms of having people around him that basically are going to kind of encourage him to do the crazy things that affect Mexico, and which, with this idea that at least he's going to give the perception that he is stopping drugs and stopping migrants, and he is making sure that Mexicans are not abusando, like they say in Spanish, and of the U.S. workers, because it's, these trade agreements, even though he himself kind of negotiated the last trade agreement, the USMCA, which has to be reviewed in 2026. I mean, he may go crazy again and use it once again as a way to pressure Mexico to do things that, clearly either politically or legally they can't do.
Absolutely. And a couple of points there. As you said, he negotiated, he was part of negotiating the USMCA. And he forced Mexico to renegotiate it in order to improve the trade balance between the two countries, because he felt that Mexico was getting all the benefit from the treaty. The reality is that after that was negotiated, Mexico is now doing even better than they were before the USMCA. So that whole strategy didn't work out. And the question now is, as you said, how crazy is it going to go? He doesn't have to look for re-election, because he shouldn't be able to be re-elected after this if he were to win.
You shouldn't.
He shouldn't. Well, he did lead an insurrection. That was already pretty crazy. And so if that was as crazy as we've seen him, and now he has nothing to hold him back, I think Mexico has a lot potentially to lose in this relationship, because he doesn't care. He is not about international relationships. He doesn't respect the commercial and cultural relationship that Mexico and the U.S. have. And he just doesn't care what happens as long as he is seen as a savior of America. And that's the only thing that he's been worried about in this one-man show. And as you said, whatever advisors he might have right now, including Vance has no power and no say over what Trump does or thinks. So
Right.
I think he's going to go much into the deep end than he did last time around.
Well, and J.D. Vance, in fact, what's interesting about J.D. Vance, if he becomes the vice president, we kind of know his positions, don't we? I mean, he blames Mexico for his mother's addiction to drugs.
Right.
He's said numerous times that the U.S. is being invaded by migrants, even though his wife is, she's not a migrant, but she is, she's first generation American from a migrant family. So it's kind of hard to wrap yourself around his comments, because he, in many ways, is become much more aggressive in his language. And once again, just close your eyes and just imagine Donald Trump is old, and he may be physically in better shape than Biden, but I don't know cognitively how well he's doing. And of course, there's now concern about, something happening to Donald Trump, and J.D. Vance suddenly becomes president of the United States if those two are elected. Let's just talk briefly, and of course, I hope you join us frequently between now and the elections. And of course, assuming that we know who won that evening, I don't think we're going to know who won November 5th. I mean, that's kind of, it doesn't matter who wins. Donald Trump is going to say he's going to win, and it's going to be kind of a long and prolonged, painful November, December, and January, until, everybody's going to hold their breath and hope that the president-elect, if it's Kamala Harris, gets sworn in. But there is, there's always this question regarding how do Mexican Americans vote? And you may recall, for the last 20, I would even say 30 years, there's been this idea, even from the Mexican government, that, you could get Mexican Americans in the United States to influence U.S. politics to benefit to benefit Mexico, or at least the Mexican government, you know, kind of the Israeli coalition. I don't see that happening in the short term, but I also, you know, it kind of raises question marks also, who are Mexican Americans going to vote for? And it may not necessarily be based on the immigration issue, like I think a lot of people in Mexico think should be the priority.
Yeah, I don't think that that's going to be the case. And look at it. We have 48 million Mexican and Mexican descendants in the US and not
Right.
one senator. Right? Cubans have
There
what,
you go.
4 million Cubans in Florida, and they have two senators, right? So
Hmm.
Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. So it's I think it's the nature of Mexicans to be apolitical or just not interested in politics, and I think that carries over when they go to the U.S. First generation or recent immigrants, they don't care. They can't vote. Probably many of them, the ones that can, they just are setting up camp and figuring things out. And I think that after the second generation, the kids that are born and raised in the US are probably more familiar and feel more like Americans than they
Right.
do identify with the roots in Mexico. So why would any of those groups vote in a fashion that actually is going to increase or improve the relations with Mexico? They simply don't care. Either they have better things to do, like work and feed their families, or they consider themselves Americans and don't really identify with their Mexican roots. So, and again, the clear example is that we don't have senators. We have no
Right.
serious legislative representation for Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the U.S. Legislation. So,
Yeah.
yeah, if you ask me how are Mexican Americans going to vote, first I'd ask which ones, and second I'd
Yeah.
probably say it doesn't
I
matter.
mean, for Mexico, it's not, I mean, it's not a sufficiently homogeneous group with similar interests to basically come out and say, we're going to support Mexico. I agree with you. I don't see it happen. But it is interesting. You raise a fascinating question in regards to, and I was speaking to some colleagues that were, you know, when I was working out of the White House long, long time ago. And they are suddenly, it's interesting how people who had left politics or had decided not to participate in this election as organizers are now coming out of the woodworks because they're very enthusiastic about Kamala Harris. You know what he mentioned was that, and we were talking about this, is that there's no Mexican American leadership in the United States right now. I mean, you don't see the Bill Richardsons or the Peñas or, you know, it's just not there. They're not nationwide figures. I mean, there's people in California, but I'm sure anyone, you know, if you're from Texas or Mexican American in Texas, you wouldn't know who they are, and vice versa, right? And if there's some legislators, some of them who have been being prosecuted, Hispanics legislators being Bob Menendez and Henry Cuellar,
Right?
among them. But yeah, but it's going to be interesting because I don't see even within the Democratic Party doing a special outreach to
Yeah.
Mexican Americans, which Donald Trump's team, I think, has identified as a flaw. I think they truly believe that despite his position on migration, that they can attract at least sufficient independent Mexican American voters that can make a difference.
Absolutely. And actually along the border in Texas, El Paso and so on, which has historically been blue, is now
Right.
turning purple. They're actually now thinking, the Republicans are, of actually having Hispanic Mexican descent candidates who are actually winning. And the reality is that Mexicans that move to the US are independent, they're entrepreneurial, they're religious, they're family oriented. They align perfectly with the Republican story that they tell. And so I think they're realizing the importance of pulling those people in, and I think this election is going to make it very clear that there is no clear correlation between Democrats and Mexicans and Mexican Americans living, especially in the southern states. And we have to remember one more thing: when people of a lower socioeconomic strata move to the United States, they want to be the last ones in. They want to close the door behind me. I don't want anybody else.
Right.
It's not like they're thinking, I want more Mexicans to come here and move
Right.
in. No, I've made
Right.
it. I'm here. I'm good. Please close the door. So again, in every sense of the equation, I think we have more alignment with Republicans than they do with Democrats, and the Republicans are realizing that much more than the Democrats are.
Gritcha, we ran out of time, and I could go on for, 1 more hour with you just conversing on all this kind of incredible news, interesting news, surprising news coming from the United States in regards to this electoral process. But promise me you come soon, and we'll start kind of choosing very specific issues to talk about that we think could impact Mexico and the future of the bilateral relationship. Richard Raether, he is a political analyst. He's the former spokesperson for Democrats abroad here in Mexico. Once again, I really appreciate you joining us.
My pleasure, Ana Maria, always.
Thank you. We're going to go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're